All right, let's dive into a really fascinating legal puzzle that gets right to the heart of India's judicial system. We're going to talk tax law, constitutional power, and a huge question about how court decisions are supposed to work. So, think about this for a second. Let's say a high court down in Madras decides a central income tax law is totally unconstitutional. Now, does a tax tribunal up in Bombay have to follow that ruling and just ignore the law? Or is the Madras decision just, a suggestion? This isn't just a hypothetical. This is the exact problem that sparked a massive legal fight. And our map through this legal maze is the 1977 judgment in Commissioner of Income Tax versus Godavari Devi Saraf. This case gave us a really brilliant, though as we'll see later challenged, answer to this very paradox. So here's our game plan. First, we'll set the stage and look at this paradox. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the tax penalty that kicked this whole thing off. We'll watch the clash between two states, unpack the super elegant principle the Bombay High Court came up with, and then watch as that principle gets dramatically overturned. And finally, we'll figure out why this case is still so important to talk about today. Okay, so let's set the scene. You've got one single national law, the Income Tax Act, which is supposed to be the same for everyone, everywhere in India. But you also have all these different high courts, and each one is the top dog in its own territory. So what in the world happens when they start interpreting that one law in completely different ways? This big abstract problem became very, very real because of one person's tax return. So let's look at the simple tax issue that somehow spiraled into this major constitutional debate. It all started with this: a self-assessment tax of 4,342 rupees. For the 68-69 assessment year, SMT Godavari Devi Saraf didn't pay this amount on time. In fact, the tax went unpaid for almost 2 years, which was a violation of Section 140A of the Income Tax Act. So, what happens? Well, the income tax officer hit her with an 800 rupee penalty, and this was done under Section 140A, subsection 3 of the Act. This specific little provision, right here, is the absolute center of our entire story. And here is where it starts to get really interesting. Smart Salairav's case, which is happening in Bombay, suddenly gets all tangled up with a court ruling from way down in Madras. This is where the legal battle lines are officially drawn. So the case makes its way up to the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal in Bombay, and the tribunal does something pretty remarkable. It just cancels the penalty. Why? Well, they said they were following a decision from the Madras High Court in a case called A.M. Sali Madikar, which had already said that Section 140A3 was unconstitutional. The key legal term you need to know here is ultra vires. It's Latin for beyond the powers. Basically, the Madras High Court had declared this section of the tax law ultra vires. They argued it gave the tax officer way too much arbitrary power without any real checks and balances, and that violated people's fundamental rights. So, in the eyes of that court, the law was legally non-existent. And this set up an absolutely fantastic legal showdown. On one side, you have the Revenue Department. They're arguing that the Bombay Tribunal is a creature of the Income Tax Act, so it has no power to question whether the act is valid or not. They insisted the Madras ruling was, at best, persuasive, not a direct order for a tribunal in Bombay. But the assessee's argument was just brilliant. They said, look, the tribunal isn't questioning the law, it's just applying the law as a competent high court has already declared it to be. And here was their killer point. The Income Tax Act is a national law, so shouldn't a declaration that it's unconstitutional apply everywhere, making that Madras ruling the law of the land? So the whole mess lands in the lap of the Bombay High Court. How are they going to solve this? Well, the answer they came up with, delivered by Chief Justice Kantawala, became known as the Godavari Devi Saraf principle. And it was just an incredibly elegant solution to a really messy problem. Now, before we unpack what the court did, let's just do a quick refresher on the doctrine of precedent. This is basically the bedrock of our whole legal system. It's the idea that lower courts have to follow the decisions of higher courts. It's all about consistency and predictability. And the Saraf case really pushed the boundaries of this doctrine across state lines. Chief Justice Kantawala's logic here was just masterful. First, he agreed with the Revenue on one point. A tribunal can't just decide the very law that created it is unconstitutional. That's a settled rule. But, he said, a tribunal is absolutely bound to follow the law as it's been declared by a high court. And then, the crucial third step. Since the Income Tax Act is an all-India law, it would be total chaos if it meant one thing in Madras and something completely different in Bombay. And that logic led to the big conclusion. A high court's declaration that a law is unconstitutional becomes the law of the land for every tribunal in the country. But, and this is the key, with one critical condition. That rule only stands until another high court issues a conflicting opinion. And this is the money quote right here. It captures the entire principle perfectly. It strikes this incredible balance between respecting the judicial hierarchy and pushing for national uniformity. It basically created a default rule that stands firm unless challenged by a court of equal power. But hold on, because this story does not end there. In a really fascinating twist, this very principle from Saraf, which seems so logical, was eventually challenged and, believe it or not, overturned. And not by the Supreme Court, but by other high courts, and eventually by the Bombay High Court itself. This timeline shows you exactly how the legal drama played out. We start in 77 with Saraf creating this law of the land principle. But remember that crucial condition? Well, it got triggered pretty quickly. Between 1975 and 82, the high courts in Andhra Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh came out with a completely contrary view. They actually upheld the law. By 1994, the legal tide had totally turned. In a case called Thana Electricity, a larger bench of the Bombay High Court did something pretty rare. It overruled its own previous decision in Saraf. So what's the rule today? Well, the Thana Electricity case set the modern standard, and it's this. A high court's decision is only binding within its own state. For a court or tribunal in another state, that decision only has persuasive value. It's a strong suggestion, for sure, but it is not a command. Now, you might be thinking, okay, if the main principle was overruled, why are we even talking about this case? That's a fair question. And the reason is that even in being overturned, Godavari Devi-Saraf teaches us some profound lessons about judicial hierarchy, administrative law, and this constant search for legal uniformity. The legacy of this case is really threefold. First, it hammers home that crucial difference between a tribunal applying a high court's constitutional ruling versus trying to make one itself. Second, its goal of having one uniform law still influences courts today, encouraging them to be consistent. And finally, it's still a foundational case for understanding how high courts supervise tribunals under Article 227 of the Constitution. So let's just quickly summarize the modern rulebook for precedent. A Supreme Court decision? Under Article 141, that's the law of the land for everyone, period. Your own state's high court, its decisions are binding on all the lower courts and tribunals in that state. A decision from another state's high court? That's persuasive. You should probably follow it unless you have a really good reason not to. And if two high courts disagree, a tribunal sticks with its home team. It follows the view of its own jurisdictional high court. Which brings us right to our final big picture thought. The whole journey of the Saraf principle, from its brilliant creation to its eventual overruling, perfectly captures this core tension that exists in any federal system. How do you balance the independence of each high court to interpret the law with the absolute need to make sure that a single national law doesn't splinter into a dozen different meanings across the country? It's a question with no easy answer, and it's one that our courts are still wrestling with today.